organization and the special guests we have here today with us. I just tallied it up. Collectively, Joan, Bruce, Betsy, Michelle, Jonathan, and I have dedicated more than 100 years of our lives to this organization. That's just crazy. But why have we done this? What is the special sauce that has nurtured and inspired us and kept HCN moving along while enduring some major setbacks? Well, the special sauce started with a guy named Tom Bell, a Lander, Wyoming rancher, teacher, wildlife biologist, World War II vet, and pain in the ass activist who saw the need for a publication dedicated to covering the West environment, which was getting short shrift in the mainstream media. I had the great fortune of knowing Tom in his later years. And every time I met him, I took the Sojourn up there to Lander. He always gave me a needed boost of energy. Keep at it, Paul. You know, even as he despaired over the degradation of the planet and the corruption in politics, that never left him. But two of us here today knew Tom as a younger man. Bruce and Joan Hamilton were in their mid-20s when HCN suddenly became their life. I was hoping you guys could open up this conversation and just paint a picture of that time. How did you get to Lander? What was it like rolling into town, meeting Tom, and coming to work for High Country News? So Joan or Bruce, I don't know which one of you wants to take the lead, but go ahead and grab it.
I'm going to start out on that. That's a good lead in. So I'm going to back up a little bit. Before we got there, Tom had a very difficult financial time for his family, and the paper wasn't bringing in much money. So he put together a paper one Thursday night, I bet it was, and he just realized what he was doing to his family's finances, and he went out and he threw the pay-stub sheets, which are what we did in those days, into the trash can. And his staff, Mary Margaret Davis and Marge Higley, were just appalled because they'd poured their lives into this publication too. And when he wasn't looking, they pulled him out of the trash. And that issue actually did get published. And readers realized at that time that the paper was going under, and they sent in what to Tom was a fortune. It was $30,000 to try to keep the paper alive. So all of a sudden he had $30,000, and he decided, well, maybe I could do this with the $30,000 if I got some editorial help. And I heard there was a job in Wyoming. I was the one-person staff of Climbing Magazine in Aspen, Colorado at the time. And I was getting a little sick of stories that described one move on the rock after another, arm by arm. And so it sounded great to me. I was interested in the environment, the outdoors. So I went up and interviewed with Tom Bell. And much to my surprise, he said, okay, you're hired right then, just after we'd had a half-hour conversation. And I said, well, I'll do it, but I need to find a job for my boyfriend. And see if he can find a job in Lander, we'll come. And he said, oh, well, that's okay. I'll just hire him too. So our pay was $30,000 a month. That sounds very
$30,000
a month.
Excuse me, $300 a month. quite a different. So it sounds rash, but Bruce had actually written an article for the magazine, for the newspaper, as an undergraduate at Colorado State University. It was an article about oil shale development in the Piceance Basin. And so Tom knew he would be an asset, and I guess he thought there wasn't that much difference between $300 a month and $600 a month. So there we were. We were kids. We had the job of our dreams. So we got to be his apprentice for about a year, but he was still feeling unsettled, and the world was unsettled. And he decided, after a year, he kind of trained us, and he decided he'd go start a self-sufficient homestead in Oregon. And he said to us, take the paper and run with it until the string runs out. And we thought, oh yeah, that'll be a year or so, and then we could go live in a cabin up in Alaska or something. It'll be fun. So we'll try that. So here we were with our own newspaper, in a place we were coming to love, on topics we loved, and we just felt like the luckiest people on earth. We covered all the things that you might expect for an environmental publication, especially the energy boom, because that's what was brand new and interesting. Lots of people from all over the country. We covered coal development, but we also covered solar energy, wind, geothermal energy development. We covered the conservative ranchers who were conservationist allies in blocking those energy projects. Thanks to a person we hired right after Tom left, Marjane Ambler, we started covering Native Americans' reactions to energy development, their efforts to become more in control of their energy resources, less exploited. She eventually wrote a book called Breaking the Iron Bonds, Indian Control of Energy Development. And she went on to edit to edit the Tribal College Journal later. We also knocked on the trailer doors down in Rock Springs and to get a sense of the lives of the workers building the Jim Bridger power plant. In other words, the social costs of energy development. In general, we were interested in all the environmental issues, of course, but also in elevating the voices of people who weren't heard in the mainstream media, whether it was workers, ranchers, Native Americans, environmentalists.
So that hasn't changed, despite some perception of readers that, oh, you're covering more social and economic issues. You guys were right from the start.
We were young journalists. We were interested in that broad perspective. I don't think we covered it as well or as much as the magazine is covering it now, but we wanted to cover it. We wanted to get the whole picture. Another editor who came during this time was Jeff O'Gara, and I loved what he said. He was working for a Capitol Hill news service, and I said, why do you want to come here? You're in DC, a very exciting place. He said, well, in DC, there are 1,000 reporters covering one story, and here there's 1,000 stories for every reporter. So what could be more wonderful than that for a journalist? And then another person that we hired was Dan Whipple. He was working on Coal Week, a newsletter for the coal industry in DC. So we got that perspective coming in. We hired Eustace Bavarskas, who was working for the UPI news service in Detroit, Michigan. On the art side, we had Hannah Hinchman and Kathy Bogan. They're both really well known in the art world now. August Daler and Jazz McDonald tried to teach us business skills, but we were impervious to their wisdom. Somehow it was easy to get people to work for $300 a month for this project. It's that special sauce you were talking about, Paul. I don't know what it was. But we called what we were doing advocacy journalism. We had a point of view. We believed that protecting the environment is good, but we tried to be fair and present all sides. We got calls every week from papers like the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, the New York Times. They suddenly had reporters who were called environmental reporters. That was something new, but they didn't know what the stories were, particularly in our region. So that was fun. I remember Bruce spending hours on the phone with these reporters, telling them about Stan Hathaway, who'd been nominated to be Secretary of the Interior. We had a party line, and as Bruce was giving them the dirt on Stan Hathaway because he'd been very bad environmentally in Wyoming, our neighbors were telling us if we didn't like it in Wyoming, just to go home during the conversation. So there was always a little tension there. Some of these papers wrote about us, and we developed a following. Edward Abbey came to interview us for an article for Playboy on the rape of the Northern Plains. And then Robert Redford came. He was writing an article for National Geographic on the Outlaw Trail, and he handed us a check for $1,000. Yeah. We couldn't believe it. We couldn't believe it. By the end of the 7 years I was there, the circulation tripled from 3,000 to 9,000. We'd set up a foundation separate from High Country News so that we could take in tax-deductible funds. And we thought we were really prospering because our revenues were going up, but every time revenues went up, we added pages to the newspaper because we wanted to give people more stuff, and we hired more people. So we made it, we thought we weren't exactly establishing a firm foundation, that's for sure. That firm foundation, as well as a stronger publication journalistically, would be built by the people who came after us. And I think I'll hand it off to Bruce there. I've gone on a long time.
Thanks, Joan. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, well, when I arrived, Tom decided to take me on a tour to go meet people, hear their stories, introduce me to them. And so we'd go off to meetings of the Wyoming Outdoor Council, Montana Wilderness Association, Northern Plains Resource Council. All these groups had just started. And Tom Bell actually started some of them on the side. But it was basically to get their stories. And I just saw High Country News as sort of a storytelling organ to make connectivity throughout the region. But I remember particularly Tom was driving across the Bighorns. It was June, and of course there was a late spring snowstorm that hit. And everywhere we went, as we walked, as we drove, he would point out and he'd tell me about how bad that water project was, or oh, that fence on that guy's property killed a whole bunch of antelope, or, you know, this is the rancher that killed and poisoned all the golden eagles in the area. And, you know, he just was a wealth of information, but also anger about what was happening to the land that he loved. We pulled out of the Bighorns and we came down to Buffalo, and he started telling me this story that I always remember, where when he was a young fish and game biologist, he went into the Johnson County Library there, and he goes up to the librarian and he says, "Have you got a copy of the Writer's Project Guide to Wyoming, WPA Guide to Wyoming?" And the librarian goes, "Shh." He says, "I'm sorry, do you have the WPA Guide to Wyoming?" "Shh." Says, "Lady, I can't talk any softer. Have you got the WPA Guide or not?" He says, "We don't carry it. It has the wrong version of the Johnson County Cattle Wars."
That's great.
Tom challenging them all the time. But he really laid out the big picture for me. And the big picture at that time was that the Northern Plains was ground zero for making the United States energy independent, particularly after the Arab oil embargo. Because we had coal seams that were 200 feet thick under Lake de Smet. I mean, this is nothing like little 3-foot seams that you find in Appalachia. You know, we had low sulfur coal that was needed because of the acid rain problem that was happening. And so everybody was coming to the Northern Plains. Also, these big strip mines didn't require unionized laborers. You could just get one big drag line and not have to deal with all the labor disputes. So there was this big mad rush. The only problems were there wasn't enough water to process it. There weren't enough rail lines to haul it out. The regional power plants, there weren't any to burn it, and the transmission lines to ship it. So there was this mad dash to build all that stuff, and very big plans indeed. I mean, we would look at these things, the North Central Power Study and things like that. They talked about taking the water from the Green River Basin and shipping it over to the Powder River Basin so they'd have enough water to develop the coal. They were going to build a whole series of coal gasification plants in North Dakota, all along the Missouri River there. It was low-grade lignite that wasn't worth shipping in a railroad car because it was 40% water by weight. You'd basically be shipping water to a distant power plant, but you could gasify it on site. So they proposed to build a whole series of gasification plants all along there. They wanted to build a coal slurry pipeline from the Powder River Basin all the way down to Arkansas to fuel another power plant there. You know, everywhere you looked, there was just crazy schemes that were up there. They even had one for nuclear gas stimulation. So the oil shale deposits in the Green River Basin, just like in the Piceance Basin in Colorado, in the Uinta Basin in Utah, they wanted to blast nuclear bombs underground, crack the rock, and that was instantly going to change the kerogen into oil that you could then turn around and burn in your home. The only problem was the gas was radioactive. Luckily, we stopped that one. But that was the kind of stuff that Tom would do. And with Tom's introduction and the credibility he had, local activists and scientists started opening up to me and sharing their insights. There were terrible odds, and they were just looking for ways to preserve their life. And at the same time, they hoped that if we would tell these stories, it would build a community, help build their own confidence, and over time, shift public opinion. And surprisingly, it did. I always thought that the Northern Plains was this redneck, red state. I mean, in those days, it was actually sort of a purple state because they had Democratic senators, Democratic House members, and they were passing the toughest strip mine laws in the country. They were passing the toughest sulfur dioxide emission control standards in the country. They had the first and toughest industrial siting laws so that companies were required to cover the social costs of their boom and bust construction craze. Steep severance taxes were imposed to cover the costs of state government and the social and environmental costs. So you could take a tax on coal and use it for a wildlife trust fund in Wyoming. These are kind of things that you just can't imagine coming out today. So after I left High Country News, because I got offered this job with a Sierra Club that paid more than $300 a month, I actually got $12,000 a year, if you can imagine it, and health insurance. I still tried to work closely with High Country News, partially because I was married to it, and partially because I just saw it as an important outlet and friend and partner in getting these stories out. And one particular story I remember working on was there was a big proposal to develop geothermal energy just over the border from Yellowstone National Park in Idaho. It's called the Island Park Geothermal Resource Area. And I started looking into this, and they said, well, you ought to go talk to the USGS scientists out in Menlo Park. So I called them up and they said, oh, you don't want to do that. All of the major geyser fields in the world, with the exception of Yellowstone, have been damaged because of geothermal development right next. It just dries up the geysers. And they pointed me to Beowawe, Nevada, which used to be the second largest geyser field in North America. And it doesn't exist anymore because they tapped it with geothermal wells right next to it. And the same thing could have happened to Yellowstone. So we got this story out in Sierra Magazine, we got it out in High Country News, and pretty soon they were holding congressional hearings about it. And they basically just shut down the thing and said, no, we aren't going to do any leasing for geothermal anywhere next to Yellowstone because it's just too valuable. So that was the kind of impact that one could have just by telling these stories and getting them out. And then, other people would pick up on it. Molly Ivins at that time was working for New York Times, and she called up about that story and then brought it up too. But the other thing I found fun about this whole thing was that Tom Bell really had a very, very strange sort of advocacy journalism. It wasn't just a matter of being on the editorial page, but Tom would go to a public hearing on wilderness. He would testify on behalf of the High Country News readers. And then he would accuse the Forest Service of lying and deceit because there really wasn't a road there where they said there was a road, and the whole area ought to be wilderness instead. And then he'd return to Lander and write up the story for the paper as he saw it. And he encouraged me to do the same. So I would go up to Jackson Hole. They wanted to extend the runway and bring jets into Jackson Hole. This was going to be a terrible thing. So I went and testified on behalf of the High Country News readers, and then wrote a story about how bad these airplanes were going to be flying right over the visitor center and buzzing the elk and the sage grouse. And this happened throughout my career there. I mean, that's how I sort of bridged between journalism and advocacy. And I think the last story I just want to tell you is when Joan and I got married, after a few months of living in Lander and working for High Country News, we went back to the East Coast and got married in my parents' backyard. And then as we flew back through Denver, we got off the plane and we went to the clean air hearings that were being held, and that was our honeymoon. That's just how much High Country News was just all consuming.
Oh my God. Well, thank you, Bruce and Joan. I want to move on to the next little period of time here, where in 1983, the HCN Board of Directors, which still included Tom Bell at the time, made a momentous decision. On a narrow vote, they hired Ed and Betsy Marston, two New York transplants who had run a small newspaper in Paonia, Colorado, to take the reins of High Country News. Ed would be the publisher, Betsy the editor. Some of HCN's stalwart readers were a little skeptical about the Marstons, as well as the move from tough as nails, Wyoming to John Denver's soft Colorado. What was the move to Paonia really like, Betsy? What challenges and surprises did you encounter in those first years?
Well, thank you, Bruce and Joan. I love the history of this bulldog of a paper. It is so it was inspiring. But the High Country News arrived in a pickup. There were photo files, a mailing list, an intern who delivered this this vault of fabulous pictures, and then quit and left. And what we got, though, I mean, it was a year of, I would say, pain and coming to grips with a restart. High Country News had about 2,400 subscribers then. Our second started paper, Western Colorado Report, had about 1,000, maybe 1,500. And we consolidated them and alienated both groups. So it was a rocky beginning, and but I don't want to go into the boohoo part, because what arrived was this paper with a sterling, unique reputation. It covered the West. Nobody else was doing it. The environmental movement was new, and in order to make democracy work, you had to tell people what was going on. And Bruce and Joan had and Tom Bell, of course, had established that that profile. So we were given this great gift of a fabulous, embattled little publication that was free to report on what nobody else was doing. It also had a nonprofit model. Early days, here's the Salt Lake Tribune trying to be a nonprofit now to get, but what you had established was a partnership with readers. They were our tipsters. And then there was the research fund. It came out of a tragic accident of a staffer, but it meant that the readers not only subscribed, but they also donated. That was our base, not foundations. We didn't have the person power to go after them. We needed readers. So we had this partnership. What else we inherited was the internship program, which we expanded. I worked with over 100 in my term, and they've gone on to do incredible things in the West. They're historians, they're reporters, they're writers, like Michelle. It was a wonderful training ground where people could pretty much, they came up with ideas, we sent them out there, they came back with wonderful stories from the ground. So we had the internship program that really grew and became an integral part of what High Country News was all about. And we had stories just everywhere. Think of the Interior Secretary at that time, James Watt, a sagebrush rebel himself, who wanted to sell off the public lands, this incredible gift that the West had, where everything happened. And I have to give credit to Ed Marston, he was a physicist who became a journalist. I actually had a master's in journalism from Columbia, so I kind of had the business in mind, but he was a writer, a thinker. He was the intellectual heart of High Country News from day one. And he was curious, how did all this stuff work? He was not Benny DeVoto, but he had the same large approach to the region. And you had federal agencies who were doing these spurious cost-benefit analyses. Hundreds of thousands of dams had been built by then. And what were the benefits of those dams? Well, the costs, somehow the agency was not going into that. We had a Forest Service doing the bidding of logging. We had, which, and partly our wildfire problem is due to those years. So what other, we had the EPA, fledgling environmental agencies at work. There were just so many, and then we had the Defense Department. Think of the MX missile But did you do those stories where they were going to put missiles on trains? They called it the racetrack. So the Soviets would never know where the missiles were. They were always going around the West. And then I guess the most exciting thing we did right off the bat was report on the Colorado River, which Ed saw metaphorically as plumbing with big buckets taken out from dams and reservoirs. And that became a book. And that was our pattern. From Ed, who would see the need to figure stuff out. Reopening the Western Frontier became a book. And he would call on writers, some were historians like Charlie Wilkinson, Hattie Limerick. Her metaphor of the West was the cowboys came to town, had a fight in the bar, left a mess, and now environmentalists had to point out that mess and get that mess cleaned up. So we had asked wonderful writers to do exploratory stories. And I have to say, intellectually, this was the most exciting part of my life. This little paper could do whatever it wanted. I mean, what better role in life could you have? We did, just to go back to that first year, we did have competition from the staff that had quit. And that was tough because that paper, Northern Lights, did have our mailing list. But the readers of High Country News assured us there was room for two, that what we were doing, news reporting on the ground, had to keep going. We were relevant. Hey, you set the path. And, and we were lucky enough to meet Tom.
Yeah.
And a road trip with Tom, as you said, Bruce, he knew everything. He knew what the trees were. He knew what animals lived there. He told me at our house, you got to cut that down. You've got to cut that tree down. Your septic system's right under there. And he was a marvel. I mean, he was a genius, and his passion lives.
Thank you, Betsy. That was awesome. I was lucky enough to be one of those interns that you hired, and I'll never forget, kind of the role model you and Ed set for me. Not only was your red pen merciless, one time you called one of my stories, you said, "That's just notes. Where's the story?" And I slowly got better and got some bigger assignments. You let me go out to the Snake River and cover the dams of the Snake River we're still trying to take those dang dams down. You sent me to the Grand Staircase Escalante after all the locals were wearing black armbands because they were protesting Clinton's declaration of the monument. And I got to talk to all the small communities there and some of the early Mormon settler families that have been there forever. And I learned a lot from those stories, but I also learned kind of by living in Paonia, which is, the town of 1,700 for those of you who don't know it. And Ed would always say, go to the local water meeting, go find out what's going on in your neighborhood, because that'll inform you about the bigger picture. And I took that lesson with me. I learned as much, coaching with my minor father friends, the Little League baseball team, as I did maybe doing the big stories. I also got to hang with Ray Ring, a person you brought in. I just wanted to mention his name. The guy was a workaholic, and he did major investigations for us in the 90s. Like the human toll of the oil and gas workers, the right-wing legislative battles over land use, for which he won a George Polk, our second, the first one by Ed and Betsy. And Betsy finally handed over the intern program to me after much, after we got too many of them, we couldn't keep them organized, I think. But anyway, I early on hired a quiet, dedicated young field biologist named Michelle Nijhuis. And I don't think we paid her a cent, but she quickly proved her mettle. And she wrote actually our first cover story ever written by an intern, or maybe the second, but an amazing feat. We were all astounded at how good she was. And so we soon hired her as an editor. And Michelle, I want you to quickly tell us, why were you attracted to HCN, and what were the key stories that you dove into here?
Well, thanks, Paul. And I hope everyone who's listening is enjoying these stories as much as I am, because High Country News does tell its own story. And I hope we've honored its history and acknowledged Tom Bell many times, but it's something else to hear it from those of you who were here. I don't think I have ever heard it told from beginning to end. So I'm just eating this up. I hope it means as much to the people listening, because that is one of the things that I don't think I realized High Country News's deep history when I arrived, but I soon did come to understand it. And it's one of the things that has kept me connected with the paper for so many years, because that history and the long relationship with readers, I think maybe most importantly, has, I think, just given, as Betsy says, it's given us a sense of freedom and ability that we can experiment and evolve and try things. And I mean, it's given us that sense in an intangible way, but also in a very practical way. Just the way that the paper is set up and supported has allowed us to preserve that integrity and that sense of that we're working on an ongoing, evolving project. And so from very early on, I was aware of that. Like I said, I wasn't aware of it when I walked in the door, but I was aware of that tradition from very early on. And it's always been just so rewarding to be a part of that, to be putting my oar in alongside people who are currently working here at High Country News and have worked here in the past and still contribute to it. But I mean, what it meant to me personally to walk in the door at High Country News was I was able to marry my interest in science with my interest in writing, and it was just love at first draft. I really have always appreciated the ability to make the connections between science and society and to make connections around the region geographically. I've always loved doing that since I arrived at High Country News, and I still enjoy doing it no matter where I'm writing.
Well, you did some of our kind of groundbreaking work on climate. I'm wondering if you can just, talk about how you stumbled across that series, which we called Hot Times, as I recall, or something like that. But this was early. This was like 2003 or 2004, right? When you started doing these stories. Remind us about that and why it was important.
Yeah, well, the way I remember it is that we were at an editorial retreat up at Laura Pascas's house in Stevens Gulch, and Greg Hanscom turned to me and said, "Nijhuis, you have a degree in science. We should write about global warming." And so I think we just collectively stumbled into it, like all journalism, it's sort of well-prepared serendipity, you have something to do with it, but a lot of it is luck. And I think I started reporting on it just as scientists in the region were willing. I mean, this sounds so quaint at the time, but at the time they were just beginning to be willing to connect what they were seeing on the ground with the patterns that their models predicted for the world under climate change, and to say, yep, what we're seeing lines right up with what these models predict, whether it's changes in snowpack or changes in forest health or wildfires or what have you. So climate change at the time was still this very abstract idea to most people, okay, average temperatures are going to go up globally, and it might mean these things, but what is it going to really mean in my backyard? And I'm still proud of that series, of what we did with that series, because I felt like we were able to make it clear to Westerners what it might look like, not only in their backyards, but for the West as a region, which is what I still think High Country News does so well, is strengthen that sense of Western identity, while still, of course, recognizing the changing nature of Western identity and the diversity of Western identity, but to find those common threads and those common experiences, and show, okay, here's what's going to happen to the West in particular in a warming world. And here's what some of the things that we all collectively value so much are going to look like in the future. So yeah, we stretched that series out for a couple of years, and most of those things now are most of the things that we predicted or the scientists predicted in those stories have unfortunately come true. And I was just thinking about this the other day, that it has become, in a sense, easier to report on climate change because people have personal stories now of experiencing climate change. But to me, that's a sign of how in some ways we failed. I feel sorry that people now have those personal stories to tell, because I think we all, those of us who were covering climate change early on, hoped that we would never see the day when it got easy.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, in the interest of time, we're going to keep going through the history here. I took on the role of publisher in 2002, which seems like so long ago now. And it was at a time when several of the talented interns who had stayed on as staffers, like Michelle, Rebecca Claren, you might remember, Matt Jenkins, Greg Hanscom, they started moving on in their careers. And I was on the prowl for the next workaholic. And I started noticing the work of Jonathan Thompson at a small paper he and his wife Wendy ran up in Silverton, Colorado. And I thought, what other small community paper would run 10,000 word investigations on the environmental impact of mine tailings? And I got, this is our kind of guy. So somehow I enticed him down from the mountain to Paonia to be our associate editor. And later he became our editor in chief. Jonathan, why did you come down from the mountain?
Yeah, that's a good question. I started actually started my own publication in Silverton, which was a crazy thing, back in 2000. And when I started it, it was, I totally modeled it on High Country News, because being a Westerner, somebody who grew up in the West and was always interested in these issues, I grew up with High Country News too. So when I moved to Silverton and wanted to start a publication, I modeled it after High Country News as much as I could, being a small publication. And I wrote those 10,000 word stories, just like you said. I came down from the mountain. Running your own little newspaper like that is extremely hard work, for one thing, but also it's lonely. You're there by yourself, and you have the readers, of course, they're always telling you exactly what they feel at the post office or on the street or wherever you are. But it's lonely, and it was also cold in Silverton. So the opportunity to move somewhere like Paonia, which is a banana belt of Colorado, was pretty enticing. And when I'll never forget the right before I started, I think in January of 2006, and in December of that year, they had after I had been hired, but before I started, there was an editorial retreat here in Hotchkiss, and I was invited to that. And I just remember, even the editors that were leaving, Michelle was there. I think maybe Rebecca Claren might have been there, I'm not sure, but Matt Jenkins was there, and Laura Paskus, and Paolo Bacigalupi was there, and Greg and Paul, and I just was so thrilled to be, amongst this sort of, not only kind of an intellectual powerhouse, but also people who were so passionate about what they were doing and the magazine. So I was thrilled, and it also confirmed my decision to come down here to Paonia. And I was an outsider in the sense that I was one of the few people who was hired as an editor who had not gone through the intern program. And so that was kind of weird, but I didn't feel like an outsider once I got here. I felt welcomed, and like people listened to my ideas, even though sometimes they were kind of crazy. I definitely came in, like I think a lot of people do when they come into High Country News, thinking I'm going to shake things up. We're going to do new stuff. We're going to get some new readers. We're going to get younger readers. We're going to delve into we're going to make, I think one of my thoughts was we're going to do a few less stories on environmental impact statements and a few less stories that sound like environmental impact statements. But when I arrived, I found that there was already this movement to do these kinds of things, but B, I also arrived, it was 2006, and it was really the crux of the George W. Bush kind of assault on the environment, is what I would say. And, people look at Trump's reign and say, oh, that was terrible for the environment and the public lands. But really, I think maybe the George W. Bush era was worse, simply because they were smarter. And, the natural gas boom was on, and I really realized that, High Country News did need to go in some new directions. It did need to get a fresh look and fresh angles, but also, we couldn't give up on being the voice to defend public lands, or to inspire people to advocate for public lands, especially at that time. And that, I really quickly realized that you can take it in new directions, but you always have to stick to those core principles and stick to what it was that High Country News, the Tom Bell and the Hamiltons and the Marstons, and, keep those roots in mind, and really draw from this incredible well of knowledge and expertise on the region that we had, the Michelles and the Matt Jenkins with his Colorado River stories and so forth. So I think that my time there was a lot of this balancing going on, because I think we wanted to balance those things, the new directions with the core pillars, but we also had to balance this idea of print versus this whole new world that was really emerging, which was the internet, and YouTube. And do we do videos? How much Twitter do we do? And there was every month it seemed like there was some kind of new social media thing that we had to do. It was really tough to I think always to hold that balance. But I think we did a pretty good job. We did some stories that Angela Garcia's story on the heroin epidemic in Chimayo. We did that in 2006, I think, right after I got there. And of course, a decade later, there's a opioid epidemic that's all over the nation. We did, Ray Ring wrote this incredible essay on suicide in the West. And a lot of our readers said, oh, that was a great essay, but you shouldn't have run it because it's not, your core pillars. But, so yeah, I think it was always this balance, but it was thrilling and exciting. And hopefully we can continue to keep that balance going, to forge new paths, but while also keeping our roots in mind. And I don't really have any Tom Bell stories, unfortunately, but luckily I do feel very fortunate that I met him when Paul and one of our interns, Jeff Chen, and I went on a road trip around Wyoming, this kind of zany road trip. And we did stop and hang out with Tom Bell for an afternoon. And it was really great because Jeff his specialty was video, kind of video stuff. So we were doing a lot of video work on this trip. And so here we had this new kind of thing that we're going forward. And here we were meeting with Tom Bell and Inlander. And that was a great sort of juxtaposition, but also an illustration of that balance that we were trying to strike.
I remember it well, and the big giant wind turbines on the freeway and pushing us off the road. And, you know, it was a hell of a trip. Well, just to keep things moving along here, the good thing is that folks like Jonathan and Betsy and Michelle never left, really. We managed to somehow sort of keep them in our orbit, even as they go on to do other things. And I think that's a real characteristic of our staff and the dedication people have to this thing. The only thing I would mention is that kind of after Jonathan left, or as Jonathan was leaving, we had the big economic crisis of 2008. And, you know, suddenly the board was all over me saying, you know, God, what's your plan B for, you know, rifting the staff? Because every other newspaper is doing this, and you guys got to get ready too to have a leaner machine. And, you know, it was shocking. And, but on the other hand, by that holiday, when we do our normal appeal in December, we resurrected Tom Bell. He was still alive. And I said, Tom, can we use a letter from you, man, in the magazine again? You've been through so many ups and downs, and, you know, you mortgaged your house and you did all these things to keep the paper going. I think readers would really respond to your voice. And so we crafted a letter, we put it out there. And man, you guys, you readers came through yet again. I didn't have to lay off anybody. And within a year or so, we had gotten some grants and some larger donations, and we were back on the road to growth. And, you know, Ed and Betsy took the magazine to 20,000 readers. I was sort of feeling bad because we just kind of stuck there, 21, 22, 23,000 subscribers. But then after 2008, we really started growing. Shot up to around 30, which is where we are today with the print, and we've got maybe 4,000 or 5,000 on the digital. And of course, we have ambitions to be much, much bigger. And I would say the other thing, just to reiterate what Jonathan said about the web, is that, yeah, really running a magazine and a website, it's a difficult thing to figure out. And, you know, we wanted to be kind of constantly up there. And so suddenly we had more freelancers that we used. We had more called on our editors to write more. And also we started doing collaborations in a way we never did before. We, in the last 10 years, have really collaborated with other news organizations. There's a lot of nonprofits out there now doing some great work. We swap stories, we put stories on each other's websites, especially around climate change and other issues. And I think that's a new part of the new era, is collaboration among organizations. So, you know, High Country News has always been, we can do it ourselves, we can do it on our own. And that's great, and that spirit has carried us, but it's also at a time now, I think, where we really have to collaborate to find the resources to do some of these deep investigations that really need to be done. Laura, there are some questions from the audience that we need to deal with here.
Yeah, there's been some questions coming in, 4 so far. If anyone has a question, put it in the Q&A box. Bruce went ahead and answered 3 of them. If you go in your Q&A box, you'll see 3 answered questions, but I'm gonna take some of these live questions. Kevin asks, Kevin, I'm going to promote you to a panelist, and I am going to ask you to ask your question for the group. Are you there?
He's got his mute on.
Turn your mute off. Enable your video. There he is. Can you ask your question for us, Kevin?
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. Sorry, I was on the phone. Somebody called me while you guys unmuted me. And my question was, feels hearing you all talk like you all felt like family, and as a reader, I often felt like family. I'm just wondering maybe how you thought that came to be. That's sort of unusual for a newsletter, magazine, newspaper, whatever.
So the question is, as a reader, I always felt like family, and it seems like the staff has felt like family. Why do you think that is? Who wants to jump in?
We needed readers to tell us what was going on. So they were tipsters. We were covering the rural part of the West, and there was no way for us to know everything that was happening. So it was really based on absolute need. And they were very smart readers. It was clear to us that they were experts in their field, but they didn't have the big picture. And that was our job, to do the big picture. So to look for local stories that had regional importance, and then we would learn how to do our coverage. So for me, they're indispensable. I do a column now, Heard Around the West. The readers tell me what's going on, who bit a nose off, how the Grizzlies are doing. So we kind of trained, I think, readers to be reporters, to be activists, we hoped. I mean, our whole theory was democracy works if journalism works. How can you tell a federal agency what you think if you don't know what the agency is doing? And they're not about to make that easy. So I think the partnership was mutually beneficial. And of course, it was a financial partnership as well, which apparently is becoming the model of journalism today.
I always felt, I came to High Country News in my early 20s. I realized the other day that I've been associated with High Country News for more than half my life now. And I always felt, or often felt, like the readers trained me, educated me, corrected my mistakes, rudely or politely, and, sent in story ideas, mentored me in all kinds of ways. And yeah, the financial model was what, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I think that I was aware that the readers were part of what made it possible for us to report on the region with integrity. And I think they were aware that they were part of that too. So I think there was a very familial, kind of intimate relationship from the start of High Country News. And I've never really encountered that anywhere else. Certainly not. I mean, I've written for publications with much larger circulations, and you hear nothing, and then you write something for High Country News and you get all kinds of letters all across the spectrum. And it's really satisfying to be in communication with readers in that very direct way.
Sorry.
Go for it, Bruce.
Even though, Joan and I make fun about the fact we only got $300 a month, we got so much more than that from the readers. We didn't have an expense account when you went on the road, but you would stay with the readers. You would sleep on their couch. They feed you dinner.
Literally.
They take you around in their pickup truck to show you the situation. And then they'd lay a bunch of elk steaks on you at the end that you could take back and throw in your freezer. And so it really was this kind of interaction and friendship that took place. So, I remember at one time there was a little section of the paper, maybe it's still there, I'm sorry, called Dear Readers. And you would, write back and forth. It wasn't just a cold letters to the editor section or a editorial, but it was really this back and forth that took place. And, they would regularly just call up. They were the sources, and they'd say, hey, I got an interesting story. Why don't you come out? And, they would then take it from there.
Yeah, I would just add in there that the staff itself, I mean, we would just go over those flats before they went to the printer so carefully. We had so many editors kind of reading to make sure we didn't misspell the headline. And we'd have arguments over what should the cover art be. We were like a family because we argued as well, and it's got along too. And we were all felt like part of this enterprise together. And I think that's one of the challenges going forth, like many organizations, we've slowly been dispersing, and suddenly the pandemic, we're totally dispersed as a staff. We're all over the place. Our editors are in Idaho and, Oregon and in Arizona and a couple different places in Colorado. And that's a great thing because it's a huge territory. But I know in our next broadcast, you're going to hear from our new editorial staff and some of our rising stars, and hear about how they're keeping that sense of working together as a team as we go forward to tackle some of extremely difficult issues, that are going to continue as the West floods with people. So yeah.
Can we take one more question?
Sure, let's throw it out there.
All right, hold on a second. Just so everyone knows, Roger had asked a couple questions that Bruce answered in the Q&A. If you want to read those and read the answer. Phil asked a question that Bruce answered. Right now, I'm going to ask Charlie Quimby, hold on, to come live and ask your question. Enable your webinar, enable your sound, and there he is.
Okay, here we go. I'm in the middle of reading Billionaire Wilderness right now, which may be familiar to some of the people in the panel. And my question is about the really the funding for High Country News as it goes forward and becomes more challenging, perhaps, to wealthy funders and the people that are putting a lot of, at least have a lot of money to devote to environmental causes, but may have different agendas perhaps than some of us who are a little bit more activist. I hope that's a clear enough question. But it's really about the monetary support that you get as you go forward and continue to challenge, myths and practices in the West.
Paul,
Yeah, I'd be glad to tackle that just for a second. Or did you have another idea, Laura?
nope, I was going to say, as a major gifts officer, go for it.
I raise money now for a living, so I guess this is me. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, we've always prided ourselves that out of our 30,000 readers, maybe 10,000 of them, a third of them almost, give a second check or a stock transfer or whatever the form is these days on top of their subscription. So, the breadth of that base is hugely important to us. On the other hand, there's no doubt that we haven't been able to expand our budget from 2 million to 4 million in the last 5 or 6 years without the help of some foundations, and also we're targeting donors that can give bigger gifts, 5-figure gifts and 6-figure gifts, which is very rare for us. We used to be about $50 and $100, and we're still about that. But there's also a careful consideration: does this money come with strings attached to it? And we're very adamant that general support money is what we really need. We're the journalists. We'll hire the stories. Give us some story ideas, great, but if it doesn't fit within our agenda as a staff and what we're doing already, we're not going to veer quickly to another thing. And I know that hasn't happened for all nonprofits groups. Sometimes if there's too much money over here and you absolutely need it, so you change your agenda. But our pitch has always been independent journalism, and that means that the funders actually don't have a say in what we cover. Just like our board of directors always gets frustrated at meetings. They give us millions of story ideas. We listen to them. Occasionally they might show up in the magazine years down the line, but they're not an editorial board. It's really the editorial staff that makes that decision. And that's a line that we can afford to do right now because we have enough people who understand this and get it. But as we get dozens and dozens of new nonprofits all seeking money for this, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, Charlie. Thanks for your question.
All right, that's it for the questions. We're at 3 minutes over, so I think we'll call it to a close. Thank you for all your lovely comments and your links in the chat box. I'm going to save the chat box and share it with the panelists because they probably didn't have time to track that as they were focusing on the webinar. I am going to record. I've recorded this, so I will let people know when it's ready for the public. I'll notify it or put it on the website or something. Paul, some closing remarks from you?
No, not really. These guys are awesome. Thank you, colleagues, for joining me. You guys are the special sauce, as are all the attendees too. You guys, we're all the special sauce. And let's keep the special sauce going because we got a lot of meals to cook up ahead of us. I don't know. Okay, that's terrible. But anyway, I love you all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, and wonderful comments. I'm just now reading them. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
bye-bye, guys.
Yeah,
Take
thank
care, everyone.
you. Bye.
Great to see your faces.